Wait. Van Gogh. What comes to mind?
Sunflowers.
Perhaps sunflowers, right. Perhaps it's the sunflowers.
Crows.
Which you have seen maybe on mugs and on note paper. They're really a very familiar picture. Or you might have seen, think of the irises. A beautiful picture. Now the original of this was sold in 1988 for, would you believe, $53 million. Now think of the contrast with poor Vincent Van Gogh, who didn't even sell a half a dozen pictures in his life. Can you imagine that? No wonder he got discouraged. So Van Gogh has given us much joy in life, hasn't he? Beautiful paintings. Yet his own life was not very joyous. Even before he became an artist, he had failed in several careers. He had been rejected a couple of times in love, and he really was already discouraged. However, once he started to be an artist, he worked fanatically, very fast, completing 1,800 pictures in his life. I mean, that's a lot, and when you realize he only painted 10 years, 1,800 pictures. However, since he sold so few, he was always dependent on his wonderful brother Theo, who sent him an allowance every month. One problem was that Vincent Van Gogh had really problems with his mental state. And tragically, in the end, he committed suicide. So it was a short life. And some people say these mental states show in his pictures, and I have some to compare over here. These bright, colorful ones were made during a comparatively happy year he had in Arles. And you can see the bright yellows, and you can see his gentleness and sweetness. We have here, let's see, La Mousme, oleanders, old peasant, and again the sunflowers. By contrast, here are pictures that he painted while he was in the mental institution at St. Remy. You can see the darkness, you can see the swirling lines, very different from the other ones. Some people say you can analyze every picture from the point of view of his mental state. And psychiatrists feel that the curvy, wild lines express his inner turmoil. Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I think I will just talk about the pictures from the point of view of art. I have, most of my presentation is going to be with some slides that our son and his wife did for us at Christmas time. But before that, I would like to briefly outline Van Gogh's life. Much of what we know about Van Gogh came from letters that he wrote to his brother Theo, all of which were saved. There's a wonderful book here that has many of his letters in it, which the Museum of Modern Art made for an exhibit in the 1930s. And Robbins went down from college and bought this for, guess what, $2.50. That's quite different from nowadays, isn't it? It's a very wonderful book. All the pictures that were in the exhibit have beside them in this book notes from his letters that explain the pictures. There are also parts of the book that tell about his feeling about art, about his feeling about life, about health. It's a wonderful resource for biographers. Vincent Van Gogh was born, I've got his life kind of in three parts. Here's his childhood, then 10 years of other careers, and then his final 10 years as an artist. He was born on March 30th, 1853, in the Dutch village of Groot Zundert, the eldest of 6 children. He had a fairly happy childhood. His father was a minister, and from him he inherited a deep respect for humanity. And I think we see that in his pictures. His father was a minister, his mother passed on her love of art and nature to him. His schooling included several years at a very good boarding school, and I'll show you later a slide of him at that age. At the boarding school, he was considered overly serious and shy, which I suppose that sounds like you might expect that of him. Well, at 16 years, Vincent left home in 1869 and began employment with an art dealer firm, working for about 7 years in galleries in Holland, London, and Paris. This was actually an important experience for him because he got acquainted with a lot of artists and their work, and he especially grew to love Rembrandt and Millet, and we'll see the effect of those in his paintings. While he was in London, he fell in love with a young woman, but was turned down. And later he was rejected by another woman, his cousin. For some reason, in 1876, he was dismissed from the art dealer business. And he tried being a school teacher, failed at that. And eventually he decided he'd follow his evangelistic tendencies and become a missionary. He worked with the missionaries in the coal mines of Belgium and developed a real appreciation for peasants and workers. And I think we see that in his pictures also. His concern for human beings was shown later when in The Hague he took in a prostitute into his home and cared for her and her family, even considered marrying her for a while. Finally, in 1880, this beginning the last 10 years of his life, Van Gogh determined that he was meant to serve humanity as an artist. And I'll elaborate a little bit more about his being an artist with my slides. But basically, he was 5 years in Holland and Belgium. This is called his Dutch period. Mostly during that time he was studying and sketching and trying out different kinds of work. But in 1886, he went to Paris, and there began the 5 years of his life, last years of his life, were all in France. He was a couple of years in Paris, where he met up with the Impressionists and was influenced by them. Then he had about 16 months in Provence, in the town of Arles, really the best time of his life. Then about a year in a mental institution near Arles, in the town of Saint-Remy. I hope I pronounced it His final months were in a town more north of Paris, the small town of Auvers, where he died tragically at only 37 years in July of 1890. Vincent Van Gogh was one of those post-impressionists, also maybe called neo-impressionists. One of the artists who began to believe that artists are not obliged to represent things as they actually exist, but have the right to express their own feeling toward the world. Now, Van Gogh and Paul Gauguin and a few others were also called expressionists. That's really basically what we should call them, an expressionist. Expressionists are defined as artists who, and if you look at the pictures, distorted or exaggerated forms and colors of nature to achieve emotional or aesthetic effects. At this point, I'm going to go over to the slides and we'll continue with his works. We better remove these, right? Yeah, that'll be fine. And everything else? Can everyone see now? Good. I know. Myra, would you be ready to put out? Okay. This photo shows Vincent as a 13-year-old in a boarding school in Holland. If it were in color, it would show reddish hair and blue-green eyes. His appearance seemed serious, even at this young age. Incidentally, the encyclopedia notes the family name should be pronounced Van Gogh. But I will use the Americanized version since we're more familiar with it. But it's interesting that it should be Van Gogh. In 1880, after attempting careers as art dealer, teacher, and missionary, Vincent Van Gogh, at 27 years of age, felt called to be an artist. He felt that it was his way that he could serve humanity. He studied art mostly on his own and painted at his home in Nieuwen, Holland, in Belgium for about 5 years. Influenced by Malay, whom you remember he got acquainted with his work when he was an art dealer, he chose workers as subjects. And here is a weaver. Through the 19th century, the skills of country handloom weavers were harnessed to the industrial economy. In Van Gogh's portrayal, the weaver appears impassive and remote, reduced to one small part of an elaborate machine. Note too the dark, earthy colors which were typical of his work before he was influenced by Impressionism. Of all the paintings and sketches during his Dutch period, this one of the potato eaters is his masterpiece. You probably are familiar with this one. Before painting it, he spent a whole winter drawing pictures and making small studies of hands and heads so that he could really paint the hard-working peasants. Vincent wrote to his brother Theo, "By witnessing peasant life continually at all hours of the day, I become so absorbed in it that I can hardly think of anything else." This absorption in his own work, was very typical of Van Gogh throughout his whole life. He always worked with great absorption. Here he showed the dignity of the family as they enjoyed the simple pleasures of their evening meal of potatoes and a warm drink. Following Rembrandt, Van Gogh used deep colors highlighted by light on their faces. The arms were long, giving them a larger-than-life appearance. In 1886, Van Gogh moved to Paris, now you can see the red hair, where his brother Theo was an art dealer. He had heard about Impressionism and was eager to learn more about color and light, as used by the Impressionist artists of the day. He became friends with many of them, including Gauguin, Pissarro, Seurat, and others. However, though greatly influenced by them, he adapted their ideas to his own way. For instance, the artist Signac recommended the use of small dots of color which mix in the eye in a method called pointillism. Now, instead of dots, Van Gogh made dashes of colors, as you can see in the two self-portraits. He also put more emotion into his paintings than the Impressionists, who were concerned mainly with color and light. I have a book called "What Makes a Van Gogh a Van Gogh?" And I think now is the time to elaborate on the distinctive style Van Gogh was developing in Paris. This is the bank at the Oise, actually painted a few years later, but it is a good example. Now look carefully at it. First, note the bold color and vivid pattern. Now I will show you some details from it. Look in the upper left-hand corner detail. He placed complementary colors next to each other to increase their power. Now look at the lady at the middle left. Van Gogh laid down thick layers of paint, very different from the smooth brushwork of some of the earlier artists we've studied. On the lower left, it showed how he created shadows and reflections with a combination of colors, not just black. Upper right, his brushstrokes are vigorous and form strong patterns. Now look at the lower right. Van Gogh outlined his figures to make them stand out. You can see how that man stands out better. I'm going to reverse it so you can take another look at the bank of the Oise. The complementary colors next to each other to increase the power, very thick, wide brushstrokes, shadows using various colors, and outlines around figures and objects. Whoops. Reversed too far there. The man shown here is Julien Tanguy, who had an art supply shop in Paris, Artists often gathered at his shop, finding him very kindly and generous, and they often called him Father, or Père Tanguy. This is the place where Vincent loved to meet other artists to talk about new ideas. He painted this portrait of Père Tanguy, showing this good, kind man with his gentle face and with his hands folded in his lap. Van Gogh became very interested also in Japanese prints, and so he painted some of them on the wall behind Tanguy. You can see the different prints there. Vincent Van Gogh painted 36 self-portraits. 27 of them were completed in Paris. You wonder, was this a bid for immortality? Or perhaps just a practical matter? He probably didn't have money to pay for a model, and he himself was readily available. So here he is, dressed in a suit. Other times, he dressed as an artist or took on some other role. The Wadsworth Athenaeum has one of these self-portraits, not one that I'm showing. And in fact, they said at the Wadsworth Athenaeum that it was one of the first self-portraits of Van Gogh in this country. And eventually, it was a private collection in the beginning, eventually given to the Athenaeum. This is a self-portrait too, but he titled it Banzai, which means monk in Japanese, indicating again his interest in Japan. Now I may be just imagining it, but don't you think the eyes have a little Japanese look? Sometimes they exchange self-portraits with other artists. This one was dedicated to Gauguin. It was probably given to his new friend, Paul Gauguin. Later, Van Gogh and Gauguin became known as the fathers of Expressionism. After about 2 years in Paris, Van Gogh became depressed by city living. He had been sick some of the time, and he just felt he needed to go to a warmer place. Thus, in February of 1888, he decided to leave Paris and go to Arles in Provence in the south of France. Perhaps the 16 months he spent there were the happiest and most productive in his life. He rented a house, shown here in a watercolor sketch. It's the one in the front right corner of that block. And here is the same house in an oil painting. It probably was the closest thing he ever had to a home of his own, something he always wished for, and here in Arles he had it for a while. Here's a painting of his cozy bedroom, showing also elements of his painting style. You can see the dabs of paint, the complementary colors next to each other, the dark outline around the furniture. And notice there are no shadows. This gives it a flat Japanese look. This painter on the road to Tarascon does have shadows and a deeper perspective than the bedroom picture. In this picture of himself, you can see him striding off to paint, equipped with all his supplies for a day's painting. He wrote his mother and sister that he looked like a dusty porcupine with his easel, canvases, and his paints sticking out all over. During the 16 months in Arles, Van Gogh completed nearly 200 paintings and 100 drawings. When he first went to Arles, it was early springtime. He has captured this and his responsive feeling in this painting called Orchard. It reminds us of springtime in Wethersfield, doesn't it? And how much we look forward to it after this cold, snowy winter. Van Gogh felt energized as he walked in the countryside or in the public gardens, which are shown here. He believed that nature was God's creation, the source of all energy and inspiration. This painting shows the oleanders in bloom. In placing a copy of Émile Zola's Joy of Living beside the jug of blooming flowers, on the left there on the table, he is telling about his own joy in flowers. There's a nice contrast in the circling strokes of the blossoms with the spikiness of the leaves. As usual, Van Gogh, a master of color, repeats the red in the blossoms with a red line around the table, while the pinkish tones of the flowers are reflected in the tones of the table, thus tying it all together. Here again is the sunflowers painting that seems to delight everyone. He enjoyed the joyful, bright yellow and decided to paint several sunflower pictures for his guest room to welcome Gauguin, who was going to visit him. Paul Gauguin loved the sunflowers too, and he painted a portrait of Vincent with a mass of the golden blossoms around him. I wish I had that picture to show you. Sometimes Van Gogh had a bright blue sky background. Other times he used shades of yellow, as in this particular favorite of ours. If you look closely, you can see each blossom has an individual character. Some of them with green tendrils, others with balls of seed ready to burst. With no shadows, this painting has some of the look of a Japanese print. All in all, the painting seems to be symbolic of Van Gogh's happiness at this time in Arles. Vincent's art dealer brother, Theo, encouraged him to paint landscapes as he thought they might be more saleable. This one is of a mower in a great golden field with a train and the modern and historic buildings of Arles in the background. There's no mention that he was ever able to sell it, however. Another landscape was this harvest at La Croix, which is one of his more well-known pictures, a scene about 3 miles outside of Arles. Vincent Van Gogh wrote about this view to be, and these are his words, as beautiful and infinite as the sea. He wanted to make that infinity show on the canvas. He started out with a higher viewpoint, as if he were standing on an elevation. In the foreground, there are long brushstrokes. Then there's a blue cart in the middle, which is sort of a foreground stopping place, before the lines lead to the middle ground, and eventually to the distant monastery and low hills. When he completed this, at the end of his first summer in Arles, Van Gogh considered it the best thing he had done so far. He also did a few beach and seascapes when he spent several days at Sainte Marie, a little fishing village near Arles. This one of fishing boats at Sainte Marie really has two parts. First, nature, which you can see as light and airy. Then man's objects, the boats, drawn precisely and with bright, flat, primary colors. In this painting of the drawbridge, all is light and airy. Even the drawbridge with its delicate lines and the inner bridge wall shimmering blue like the water. The cypresses are delicate and tall, quite different from the ones Van Gogh did later. Cafes are usually lively, sociable places, and Van Gogh particularly liked this one in Arles, which he titled Sidewalk Cafe. The lines of the cobblestones and the people crossing the street guide your eyes to the warmth of the cafe. He was fascinated by the kinds of illumination, the golden lights of the cafe lamps and the windows, contrasting with the whitish blue of the starry sky. Van Gogh wrote to Theo, "The night is more richly colored than the day." Also he noted, "I am proud of painting a night picture without anything black, nothing but beautiful blue, violet, and green." By contrast, his painting Night Cafe has a more disquieting atmosphere. He wrote about this one, "I have tried to express the idea that a cafe can be a place where one can ruin one's life, run mad, or commit a crime." His colors are dark red and yellow, with a green billiard table. The sleeping figures and the clock at a little after midnight add to a total feeling of dreariness. The bouquet of flowers seems out of place. It was interesting that this cafe picture and the sidewalk picture are quite different in atmosphere, yet both were made in the same month in Arles. During the winter of 1888, while still in Arles, Van Gogh turned to portraiture, which he felt should be an important part of modern art. This is La Musume, which means Japanese girl. And it's the title of the picture, even though it is obviously a local girl from Arles. The young girl has a delicately modeled face with little touches of warm and cool tones. In sharp contrast are the intense colors and stripes and spots of her dress, broken only by the neutral arches of the chair. The curved line of orange buttons and the dainty red ribbon in her hair are perfect finishing touches. This portrait of Joseph Roulin, the postman, was one of several Van Gogh painted of him and members of the Roulin family in Arles. Joseph Roulin was his closest friend. In spite of the uniform with its symbol of authority, the postman has a floral background, and he has a patriarchal beard and a very benign look. Typically, there was feeling and emotion in his portraits as in his other paintings. He did many paintings of his friend Joseph Roulin. Here's Van Gogh's sketch of the same postman. Van Gogh did many sketches during his career, in addition to the oil paintings. They are really special in themselves, and I'm sorry I don't have time to cover them too. I show this picture so that you can see his unique style. For this one and others, he used a Japanese pen and ink. And Dorothy Wiley has brought in a book showing other sketches, including charcoal. You might like to look at that afterwards. This is a portrait of Armand Rouland, another member of the family. And this is Camille. Van Gogh painted portraits of about 40 of his neighbors during the winter of 88-89. This one is called L'Arlésienne, meaning a woman of Arles. With her husband, Madame Genoux operated a cafe near Van Gogh's house. He decided to paint her in the traditional costume of Arles. You can see how the darkness of her costume stands out against the bright wall, and how the orange of the chair is echoed in the books. You may wonder, why is the lace at her neck and the book page green? The answer is that Van Gogh, knowing colors so well, felt that pure white would be too bright. There is more to this painting than just color. Van Gogh gives insight into the individual. Her face and the books show her as an intelligent, thoughtful person. As compared to the benign postman that I just showed you, this portrait of a man shows a very haughty expression. The angle of the painting adds the man's disdainful attitude. It seems close to caricature. This painting, Old Peasant, is considered by many to be Van Gogh's best portraiture. You are drawn first to the face, then to the eyes, and then to the masterfully drawn hands. Here is a person with character and strength, which is how Van Gogh liked to portray his peasants. Remember one of his first masterpieces, The Potato Eaters? These colors are quite different from his early Dutch stage of painting. Instead of earthy tones, there is bright color in the blue jacket, the yellow hat, the red against the orange background. Note that there are touches of the same bright blue, yellow, and red in the face, giving the painting a unity. Van Gogh painted a pair of chairs. This one is titled Van Gogh's Chair, and the other painting, which I'll show you in a minute, was titled Gauguin's Chair. His own chair may symbolize the comfort and rest he felt so often in the 16 months he was in Arles. It shows his pipe on the chair with some tobacco and some onions in a box in the background. Notice how the yellow line on the door connects with the chair. Now, here is Gauguin's chair, much fancier. Vincent Van Gogh had invited Paul Van Gogh to Arles, and he had hoped to start a studio of the South with Gauguin and other artists. Unfortunately, Van Gogh and Gauguin did not get along very well, and after many quarrels, Gauguin left. Van Gogh wrote that the candle was in the absent one's place, and so this painting may symbolize his great sadness at Gauguin's departure. After their final quarrel, Van Gogh, in a fit of madness and despair, picked up a razor and slashed off his right ear. This self-portrait shows Van Gogh's bandaged ear. There he is smoking a pipe even with the bandage on. He seems kind of casual about it. But young children began to taunt him, and former friends deserted him because of his stranger behavior. And this just made his despair deepen. He began to fear that he was going mad. Eventually, he was persuaded by a local doctor to commit himself to a mental institution in nearby St. Remy in May of 1889. The diagnosis was never entirely clear, but both epilepsy and schizophrenia have been suggested. He spent a year at the hospital at St. Remy. During much of the time, he continued his painting. In fact, he did over 100 paintings during that year. There was noticeable change in the style, as I mentioned before. They became full of curving lines, as in this landscape with olive trees. He was drawn to the tough cypress trees that were in the area. He thought of these as obelisks. Van Gogh did many cypress paintings. Here is one example. The color, as he wrote to Theo, is a difficult bottle green. For this he used a yellow green, and then he had lavender and blue branches showing through. He put the paint on with very, very thick brushes, thick paint, in very curving and spiraling brushstrokes. In fact, the background has the same kind of swirling motion. There doesn't seem to be a straight line in the picture. This enlarged detail from the painting I just showed you depicts the strokes more clearly, both in the tree and the background. You can see how thick it is. His landscapes began to take on an unearthly look. In this road with cypresses, the cypress rises up between the moon on the right and the sun and the star on the left, each with a vast halo. In contrast to those unearthly aspects, there are two very ordinary people walking along, and a horse and a wagon. Somehow, Van Gogh holds the contrasting parts all together with color and a common type of strokes. This is Evening Walk. Evening Walk combines Van Gogh's new curving brushstrokes with his love of color. Note the bright golden sky echoed in the yellow and blue figures in the foreground. Starry Night. This very famous painting, Starry Night, was a view from his hospital room and seems to have come from a time of religious fervor. It shows how Van Gogh, like other expressionists, distorted or exaggerated the ordinary forms and colors of nature to achieve emotional and aesthetic effects. The night sky is full of spinning stars and whirling comets, and the sun on the right is eclipsed by the moon on top of it. The sky contrasts with the straight lines of the houses in the little town. The church steeple and the cypress seem to reach to heaven. Some say that Van Gogh might have been recalling the Old Testament story about Joseph. Remember when he saw 11 stars and the sun and moon bowing down before him? If you count, there are 11 stars there. So that could very well be an explanation. There were some calmer times during his hospital stay, and Van Gogh loved to visit the garden of a nearby artist, Charles Daubigny. Van Gogh made a series of paintings of this garden, showing his love of nature's abundance. Here is nature, secure and domesticated. There's even a cat crossing in the front. This close-up of the irises was also painted during the Saint Remy year. The flowers are arranged decoratively across the surface like a Japanese print design. The close-up view of the blooms and the green leaves gives a real feeling of luxuriance. This is the irises picture that was shown in the 1889 Salon of the Independents. The same one sold 100 years later for $53 million. Van Gogh had always admired the work of the artist Jean-Francois Millet, and he felt that the human soul was visible in his work. While in Saint Remy, he found it comforting to copy some of Millet's sketches onto his own canvas and painting them in his own colors. One of these was entitled First Steps, kind of an appealing picture. Van Gogh's brother Theo had recently married, and Theo and his wife, Joanna, were expecting their first child. Vincent sent them this painting for his nursery. The child was born in January 1890 and happily was named after his Uncle Vincent, which of course gave Vincent Van Gogh great joy. After a year in the mental institution, Vincent Van Gogh decided to leave in May of 1890. This self-portrait shows him at about that time. He first went to Paris to see Theo and meet Joanna and his young namesake. Then, at Theo's suggestion, he decided to settle in Aubert on the Oise River north of Paris, where he could be a patient of a Dr. Gachet, who was also an art lover, and many artists painted there at Dr. Gachet's house. The doctor, who admired Van Gogh's work, advised him to continue his painting. This he did, in fact, completing about one canvas a day in Aubert during the last months of his life. He liked the small town very much and was eager to record for posterity the houses, the church, the fields, the farms. And Keith brought us one poster that you can look at later of this same picture. It was also here that he did the painting of the bank of the Oise, which I showed you as an example of his styles. He continued painting portraits, including this lovely one of a peasant girl posed in a meadow of flowers. Vincent Van Gogh easily related to his doctor, who also had suffered from depression and was very understanding of Van Gogh's mental condition. About this portrait of Dr. Gachet, Vincent wrote to his brother, "I am working at his portrait. The head with a white cap, very fair, very light. The hands, also a light flesh tint, a blue frock coat and a cobalt blue background, leaning on a table on which are a yellow book and a foxglove plant with pink flowers." Now those don't look like pink flowers, but that's how he described it. It has the same feeling as the portrait of myself, Van Gogh wrote, which I brought with me to this place. Here is the famous painting, I think someone mentioned this in the beginning, Crows Over a Wheat Field. completed in July 1890, a few days before his death. He chose a wide canvas in order to capture the vastness of the fields. A storm was just brewing, as you can see in the wind-blown field and in the darkening sky. The crows are hurrying to find shelter. Some biographers feel that the storm is an omen of Van Gogh's death, but he himself saw golden wheat as an affirmation of life. At this time, Van Gogh was just beginning to be recognized as an artist. He had even been invited to exhibit at an important show in Brussels, and a favorable article had appeared in a new art magazine. Yet, he felt burned out. His former enthusiasm for painting seemed gone, and his efforts with each picture exhausted him. At the same time, he was concerned about his brother Theo's possible loss of his job, and he worried that he himself might never be able to pay Theo back for the years of financial support. He also desperately feared another attack of mental illness, and all of this anxiety was just too much for him. One summer afternoon, July 29, 1980, Vincent Van Gogh took his shotgun with him to a hill near Auvers and committed suicide. He was buried on the left at Auvers, and a few months later, his grieving brother Theo tragically also died and is buried there beside him. Theo's widow took care of his paintings and saved all his letters, and later his nephew and namesake helped start the Vincent Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. The graves and in fact the whole town of Auvers has become a mecca for those who admire Van Gogh's art. We visited Auvers in 1992 with our son Dave, his wife Linda, and their children Jeff and Susie. The houses in my photograph look just like the houses Van Gogh painted over 100 years ago. In Auvers, they have developed a unique outdoor museum of paintings by Van Gogh. Local people have located sites where Van Gogh painted. At each site, they have placed in a glass frame a large print of the particular work of art, so that you can view the scene and the painting at the same time. Here are Dave and Jeff looking at the painting titled Church at Auvers, and then at the church itself. And here is the photo of the church that I took when we were visiting. And this is Van Gogh's painting. He put himself into it, didn't he? Similarly, other Van Gogh prints are placed by the wheat fields, the river, and the houses around town. Probably one of the most unusual museum displays we've ever seen, all out of doors. It's difficult for me to find the words adequately to summarize Vincent Van Gogh and his greatness as an expressionist artist. To help me do this, I have chosen a few paintings and some paragraphs from some of the art books I have. What makes Van Gogh a unique artist is the power of giving us, at the same time, a most vivid sense of the quality of things, and an equally compelling revelation of his own feelings. In his painting of a sunflower or a peasant or Wheatfield, we enjoy the beauty and vitality of simple objects. But he can communicate also his overflowing passionateness, his ecstatic appreciation, and something of the loneliness and need for love which brought him to art as a means of touching others. He achieves this high expressiveness by a daring use of color, more intense than in previous art, with new and surprising harmonies, and also by the vigor of the brushstrokes and lines. In Vincent Van Gogh, the opposites of reality and emotion are reconciled and united. As has happened with other artists, Vincent Van Gogh's art became more appreciated after his death. As I mentioned, his nephew and namesake started the Vincent Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And as we know, his paintings are now exciting aspects of both private collections and museums all over the world. Let's see, now we can have the lights. I would like to refer to over here. This is one of Keith's pictures. I think probably this was in Paris when he was first being influenced by the Impressionists. It doesn't have a date on it, but that would be my feeling. Here's another picture of Iris. Not the one that got the $53 million, but I'm sure plenty valuable.
I'd sell it for 50.
Here's the drawbridge. He must have done the drawbridge from different angles because this is the other side of the drawbridge from what I showed you in my slides. But if you come up closer, you can see his strokes, his brush strokes, and how he uses color. This was in Aubert. These were both Aubert. And this was, no, excuse me, these were both in R. And this was in the last town where he was, in Aubert. And when we went to visit that town, this is how it still looks. Have any of you been there? It was so exciting to walk around town and see these places and then the poster beside. Over here on this side we have another picture, a different one from the one I showed you, of him with a bandage on his ear. I don't know why he wanted to paint it, but probably that was part of his getting through the experience.
That's a Japanese print on it.
Yes, right. It may be he's telling us even though his ear is bandaged, he can still keep working. I don't know. Betty Preston has the same book that I have, What Makes a Van Gogh a Van Gogh. This is a wonderful series. They have them with other artists too. You might like to look at those. And here's a book, Lust for Life, written by Irving Stone of Van Gogh's life. Have any of you read this? Yeah. So much of this, for much of this, he used the letters that Theo had written, that Van Gogh had written to Theo. So I guess that's about it. Please come up and look around.
That was a superb.
Actually, we have that movie at home among our collection of old movies. If anybody would like to see it, we could invite you over sometime to see the movie. Anybody? Any music? And check out the beautiful sculpture portraits.
How long is it? You know how long it runs?